For nearly a year, a fresh loaf of bread appeared every morning on the eastern steps of Ravensmere Hall. It was always warm, always wrapped in the same square of plain linen. Always left before sunrise. No servant admitted baking it. No guard ever saw who delivered it. Even on mornings when fresh snow covered every path, the bread waited neatly upon the stone, while the ground around it remained strangely undisturbed. The Duke of Ravensmere disliked mysteries. He ordered the first loaf removed without comment. The second was sent to the servants' hall. When the third appeared, he instructed the guards to double their watch. By the end of the month, he found himself doing something he had not expected. Every morning, before opening a single letter or meeting a single steward, he looked first toward the eastern steps. The bread was always there. Nathaniel Ashcombe had inherited Ravensmere Hall less than a year earlier. Along with the title came 3 prosperous estates, hundreds of tenants, countless responsibilities, and a silence that had settled over the hall ever since his father's funeral. Before the old duke died, Ravensmere had rarely been quiet. Guests arrived almost weekly, musicians performed in the drawing room, and dinners stretched late into the evening. Nathaniel had often escaped those gatherings whenever he could, preferring books to conversation. Now the great house stood almost empty. The invitations continued to arrive. He declined them all. Friends gradually stopped calling. Even his servants learned that their master preferred solitude to company. Only Mr. Ashwell, the elderly butler who had served the family for nearly 40 years, still dared to speak to him with quiet familiarity. On one particularly cold morning, the butler carried the mysterious loaf into the breakfast room. "It has arrived again, Your Grace." Nathaniel barely looked up from the estate papers spread across the table. "So I see. You still have no wish to know who leaves it?" "I wish to know." He folded another letter before answering. "I simply have no intention of encouraging strangers to wander onto my grounds." Mr. Ashwell hesitated. "I have often wondered." Nathaniel glanced up. "Whether the person expects gratitude?" The old butler smiled faintly. "No, Your Grace. Whether they fear you may need kindness more than thanks." The room fell silent. Nathaniel gave no answer. When Mr. Ashwell quietly withdrew, the Duke looked once more at the loaf resting beside the untouched breakfast. For reasons he could not explain, he left it there. 3 miles away, the ovens inside Hart's bakery had already filled the little shop with warmth. Elizabeth Hart had been awake since long before dawn, kneading dough beneath flour-covered hands that had learned the work from childhood. She was 29 years old and had inherited the bakery after her father's death 18 months earlier. What remained of the business was modest: 2 aging ovens, shelves repaired more than once, and enough loyal customers to keep the doors open if each week proved kind. Every morning she baked more bread than she expected to sell. Not because she miscalculated. Because someone always needed it. Before the first customers arrived, she quietly set aside several loaves. One would go to Widow Fletcher. Another to the Hales family, whose youngest children never seemed to have enough breakfast. A smaller loaf belonged to old Mr. Collins, the retired schoolmaster who insisted he could manage perfectly well, while accepting every gift with suspiciously grateful eyes. The final loaf was always the largest. She wrapped it carefully in fresh linen. That loaf never appeared in the bakery window. Years earlier, when Elizabeth was still a little girl standing beside the ovens, she had once asked her father why he insisted on baking an extra loaf every day. No one ordered it. No one paid for it. Her father had smiled while dusting flour from his hands. "Because, my dear girl, no one should wake believing the world has forgotten them." She never forgot those words. Not after his death, not after the lonely months that followed, and certainly not after hearing quiet stories carried from Ravensmere Hall by tradesmen and stable boys. The new Duke rarely left the estate. He seldom entertained guests. Some claimed he hardly ate. Others whispered that grief had turned him into a stranger even within his own home. Elizabeth never repeated such stories. Grief looked different for everyone. She knew that better than most. So each morning before the village stirred awake, she carried one warm loaf toward Ravensmere Hall. Not because she expected the Duke to eat it, simply because she hoped that somewhere inside the great house, someone would know they had not been forgotten. She used the old orchard path her father had shown her years before. It had once served the gardeners delivering fresh produce to the kitchens, though almost no one seemed to remember it now. A weathered side gate no longer closed properly. allowing her to slip quietly through without disturbing the household. She never stepped beyond the eastern portico. She placed the loaf carefully upon the stone step. Then she left. For nearly 11 months, no one ever saw her. Or so she believed. Nathaniel eventually concluded that more guards would accomplish nothing. Whoever delivered the bread knew the estate too well. So on the first bitter morning of February, he dismissed every servant before dawn. No guards. No footmen. No stable boys. Only himself. He waited alone beneath the shadow of the eastern portico, the cold seeping through his gloves as the first pale light spread across the gardens. Minutes passed. Then he heard soft footsteps crossing the frozen orchard. A woman emerged through the mist. She wore a simple dark cloak against the winter air, a basket resting lightly upon one arm. Her movements were calm, almost practiced, as though she had walked the same path hundreds of times before. She climbed the steps without hesitation, carefully placed the warm loaf upon the stone, smoothed the linen with surprising tenderness, then turned to leave. Nathaniel stepped out of the shadows. "You have gone to remarkable lengths." His quiet voice stopped her where she stood, trying to remain invisible. Elizabeth slowly turned. For the first time, their eyes met. Neither spoke. The silence between them felt strangely familiar, as though the conversation had begun many months earlier, with nothing more than a warm loaf of bread left upon a cold stone step. Nathaniel was the first to break it. "So?" He looked briefly at the bread before meeting her eyes again. "It was you." Elizabeth held his gaze, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. "I believe, Your Grace," she answered softly, "that depends on whether you intend to thank me." A tiny smile touched her lips, or ask me to stop. Nathaniel remained standing beneath the eastern portico long after the young woman had stopped walking. She had not looked frightened, nor had she seemed embarrassed to discover that the Duke himself had been waiting for her. Instead, she had answered him with a quiet confidence that lingered in his thoughts long after she disappeared beyond the orchard. "I believe that depends on whether you intend to thank me, or ask me to stop." For the first time in many months, Nathaniel realized he wanted neither. Instead, he wanted to understand. An hour later, Elizabeth found herself seated in the breakfast room overlooking the eastern gardens, a cup of tea warming her hands while morning sunlight slowly dissolved the frost beyond the windows. The room reflected the Duke himself. Beautifully ordered, perfectly maintained, and strangely lonely. There were no family portraits on the side tables, no flowers brightening the windows. No evidence that laughter had visited the room in a very long time. Nathaniel noticed her quiet observation. He offered no explanation. Instead, after allowing the silence to settle comfortably between them, he asked the question that had occupied his thoughts for nearly a year. Why? Why would a woman who had never spoken to him rise before dawn, every morning simply to leave a loaf of bread at his door? Elizabeth answered without hesitation. It had never been charity. Her father had been a baker all his life, and every morning before opening the shop, he insisted on baking one loaf that no customer had ordered and no one would ever pay for. When she was a little girl, she once asked why he willingly gave away part of what little they earned. He had smiled and replied with words she had never forgotten. No one should wake believing the world has forgotten them. After his death, Elizabeth simply continued the tradition. The widow living alone at the edge of the village received one loaf. The Hales children received another. Old Mr. Collins, who always claimed he needed nothing, quietly found fresh bread waiting at his door. The final loaf had always been for Ravensmere Hall, not because its owner was wealthy, but because grief often left a person poorer than poverty itself. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. No one had ever described his loneliness so plainly. Yet somehow, hearing it spoken without pity made it easier to accept. He admitted something he had told no one else. When the first loaf appeared, he assumed someone sought favor. When it continued arriving through storms, snow, and bitter mornings, he believed someone was mocking the household security. He had ordered additional guards, changed their positions, even searched the grounds himself. Elizabeth listened quietly before a faint smile appeared. She confessed she had noticed every change. Her father had once delivered bread to Ravensmere's kitchens, and had shown her an old gardener's path almost forgotten by everyone else. The neglected orchard gate still opened just enough for a careful visitor, while every guard watched the grand entrance instead. Nathaniel could not help smiling at the thought. For 11 months, an entire household had searched for an intruder while overlooking the simplest path of all. When breakfast ended, Nathaniel walked with Elizabeth toward the eastern steps where the mystery had begun. The loaf still rested exactly where she had left it. He picked it up for the first time. The bread remained warm. Only then did he realize something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Every morning before the hall awakened, someone had spent hours preparing this single loaf. Not for recognition, not for reward. Simply because they believed one lonely stranger deserved a small reminder that kindness still existed. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Elizabeth looked at him with gentle surprise. "For searching for you, for misunderstanding you." She shook her head. "I never expected you to understand, I only hoped you would eat the bread." Nathaniel glanced down at the loaf in his hands. "I shall begin today." The following morning. For the first time since inheriting the dukedom, Nathaniel rode into Hartwell village without announcing his arrival. He left his carriage behind and came alone. Dressed simply enough that few people noticed him before he reached the bakery. The little shop was warm, carrying the comforting scent of fresh bread, butter, and cinnamon. Elizabeth stood behind the counter, arranging the morning's loaves while greeting each customer by name. She remembered which widow preferred darker bread, which child disliked raisins, which elderly gentleman always forgot his change. Nathaniel remained quietly near the doorway for several minutes before she finally looked up and smiled. There was no surprise in her expression, almost as though she had expected him. He purchased an ordinary brown loaf like any other customer. When he offered payment, however, Elizabeth gently pushed the coins back across the counter. "The first loaf of the day," she said softly, "is never sold." Nathaniel looked at her curiously. "It is always given." For a long moment, he simply stood there. Then, without another word, he accepted the loaf. As he stepped back into the cold morning, he realized something that had escaped him for nearly a year. Elizabeth Hart had never brought bread because he was a duke. She would have done exactly the same for anyone carrying the same quiet loneliness. And somehow, that simple truth made the gift more precious than anything money or a title could ever have purchased. Nathaniel told himself that his visits to Hart's bakery were matters of convenience. The village lay on the road between Ravensmere Hall and several tenant farms. And stopping for a loaf of bread required little more than a few additional minutes. It was, he assured himself, an entirely practical habit. Mr. Ashwell believed otherwise. Within a fortnight, the elderly butler quietly noticed that the Duke, who had once rushed through breakfast without tasting it, now asked whether the bakery had already opened before leaving the estate. On mornings when heavy rain delayed his ride into the village, Nathaniel seemed strangely distracted, as though an important part of the day had failed to arrive. The bread had first drawn him toward Hartwell. Elizabeth made him want to return. Their conversations remained simple. She never treated him as a man who needed constant admiration. Nor did she speak with the nervous caution that usually surrounded his title. Most mornings, she served customers while talking naturally with him, pausing only to wrap another loaf or greet a child who ran into the shop clutching a few precious pennies. Nathaniel soon realized something remarkable. Elizabeth knew nearly everyone in the village by name. She remembered whose husband had fallen ill, which family had welcomed a new baby, and whose harvest had failed after an early frost. More importantly, she remembered these things because she cared, not because they might someday prove useful. Watching her, Nathaniel began noticing people he might once have passed without a second glance. The old cooper whose hands trembled too badly to carry his own firewood. The widow who insisted she required no assistance, while secretly buying only half the bread her grandchildren needed. The young stable boy who lingered outside the bakery each morning simply because the warmth drifting from the ovens reminded him of the mother he had lost. For years Nathaniel had managed an estate. Elizabeth quietly taught him how to know a community. One afternoon he arrived to find the bakery unusually empty. Only Elizabeth remained inside, kneading fresh dough while flour dusted the sleeves of her simple dress. "You seem disappointed," she observed without looking up. "I had expected a queue." "So had I," she smiled. The rain discouraged everyone except one determined duke. Nathaniel glanced toward the large wooden table where dozens of small loaves rested beneath linen cloths. "You've baked far more than you can sell today." "I know. What will happen to the rest?" She answered as though the matter required no thought. "They'll find someone who needs them." Nathaniel had heard her father's lesson before. Yet seeing her live by it every single day moved him more deeply than hearing it spoken. Kindness, he realized, was not something Elizabeth performed. It was simply the way she lived. Not long afterward, another name from their earliest conversation returned to his thoughts. Tom Hale, the bright 11-year-old boy who delivered flour to the bakery after helping his father in the fields. Elizabeth had once mentioned almost in passing that Tom devoured every newspaper he could borrow despite never having attended a proper school. The memory refused to leave Nathaniel. Quietly, without announcing his intentions, he asked the village schoolmaster to meet the boy. A week later, the answer arrived: Tom possessed an extraordinary gift for learning. Before the month ended, Nathaniel arranged not only for Tom's education but also for several other village children, whose families could never have afforded tuition themselves. The expense barely registered among the estate accounts, yet its effect spread quickly through Hartwell. Elizabeth learned of it only because Tom burst into the bakery one morning carrying his first schoolbooks. She needed no explanation. Only one man in the county would have acted so quietly. That afternoon, she walked to Ravensmere Hall. Nathaniel was overseeing repairs to the neglected orchard wall when she found him. "You've been keeping secrets," she said gently. He looked up from the stone plans in his hands. "I wasn't aware I possessed any. Tom received his schoolbooks this morning." Nathaniel smiled faintly. He seemed pleased. "You changed that boy's future. He earned it himself." Elizabeth shook her head. "Most people would have announced such generosity. I didn't do it for most people." The answer came so naturally that neither of them noticed what it revealed. Nathaniel no longer sought approval. Somewhere along the way, Elizabeth's quiet example had taught him that the greatest kindnesses rarely required an audience. Not everyone viewed these changes with equal warmth. Lady Beatrice Ashcroft had known the Ashcombe family since childhood and had long assumed that, when the Duke finally married, his choice would naturally come from among England's oldest noble families. During her first visit to Ravensmere that autumn, she observed far more than Nathaniel imagined. She noticed how often the servants mentioned Miss Hart with genuine affection. She noticed fresh bread arriving in the kitchens each morning. Most of all, she noticed that the Duke smiled more easily after returning from the village than he ever had after an evening in London's finest drawing rooms. Lady Beatrice asked no questions. She merely watched. People who relied upon social position rarely hurried. They preferred to wait until the perfect moment presented itself. As winter slowly approached, preparations began for Ravensmere Hall's annual Christmas gathering. 4 generations, the Ashcombe family had opened the hall to neighbouring landowners, clergy, village leaders, and those who had served the estate faithfully throughout the year. It remained the largest event on the county calendar, requiring weeks of planning. One evening, while reviewing the guest list in the library, Nathaniel found his thoughts returning to a single name: Elizabeth Hart. She had never attended a gathering of that kind. She belonged to neither the aristocracy nor the wealthy merchant families usually invited. Yet imagining Christmas at Ravensmere without the woman who had quietly transformed both its master and its household suddenly seemed impossible. Mr. Ashwell noticed the Duke holding the invitation a little longer than the others. "I believe," the old butler said with a knowing smile, "there is one guest your Grace hopes will accept." Nathaniel looked down at the blank invitation still resting beneath his hand. For the first time in many years, the decision before him made him feel less like a duke, and far more like an ordinary man. The annual Christmas gathering at Ravensmere Hall had always been a celebration of tradition. 4 generations, the great house welcomed neighbouring landowners, clergymen, magistrates, and the most respected families of the county. The evening was conducted according to customs that had changed very little over the years, and every guest understood the quiet rules that governed such occasions. This Christmas, however, one invitation attracted more attention than all the others. Miss Elizabeth Hart. By the time her name appeared on the guest list, whispers had already begun travelling through drawing rooms across the county. Some wondered why the daughter of a village baker had been invited at all. Others assumed the Duke wished only to reward a charitable soul whose kindness had become known throughout Hartwell. Only a very few suspected the truth: that Elizabeth's quiet presence had already changed Ravensmere Hall long before she ever crossed its front door as an invited guest. Elizabeth accepted only after considerable hesitation. She owned no magnificent gowns, and possessed none of the effortless confidence expected in aristocratic society. She understood perfectly well that she would be noticed the moment she entered the ballroom. Not because of who she was but because everyone else believed she did not belong there. When she arrived that Christmas evening, those expectations proved correct. Conversations softened. Curious eyes followed her across the entrance hall. Nathaniel greeted her himself before any servant could announce her name. "You came. I nearly didn't. I'm very glad you changed your mind." The warmth in his voice eased much of the nervousness she had carried with her. For the first time that evening, Ravensmere Hall felt a little less overwhelming. The Christmas dinner began peacefully. Music drifted through the hall while candlelight reflected from crystal glasses and polished silver. Nathaniel remained occupied greeting his guests, though more than once he found his attention wandering toward Elizabeth, who spoke easily with the village rector's wife and several elderly tenants seated nearby. Lady Beatrice noticed every glance. She waited until dessert had been served before speaking. "I confess," she said pleasantly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "This may be the first Christmas dinner at Ravensmere where the baker has dined before the Baron." A few uncertain smiles appeared around the table. Elizabeth understood the insult immediately. Lady Beatrice continued without raising her voice. "I suppose kindness has become the newest qualification for entering aristocratic society." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Elizabeth looked down briefly at the folded napkin resting upon her lap, before meeting Lady Beatrice's eyes. "I've never wished to enter aristocratic society." Her answer remained calm. "I only accepted the Duke's invitation." Lady Beatrice smiled politely. "And yet invitations have a way of suggesting importance. They suggest generosity." Elizabeth's voice never hardened. "Nothing more." She paused only briefly. "My father always believed a person's place at a table should be determined less by birth than by whether they leave others hungrier or happier after sharing it." No one spoke. The words had been gentle. Their meaning had not. Nathaniel quietly set down his glass. "I quite agree." His voice carried easily across the table. "If Ravensmere has become a better home this year, it is because Miss Hart reminded its owner what hospitality was meant to look like." Lady Beatrice lowered her eyes. The conversation moved on. The matter, however, had not ended. Later that evening, Elizabeth slipped quietly out into the snow-covered gardens. She had no wish to become the center of whispered conversations or curious speculation. The cold air felt wonderfully honest after the careful manners of the dining room. She stood beside the frozen fountain where fresh snow covered every path. Footsteps approached behind her. She knew who it was before he spoke. "I hoped I would find you here." Nathaniel stopped beside her, looking across the silent gardens. "I'm sorry." She turned toward him. "For Lady Beatrice. For allowing you to face any of that." Elizabeth smiled gently. "You didn't." "I chose to answer." He looked down at the snow beneath his boots. "I've spent most of my life believing responsibility meant protecting people from hardship. And now I think it sometimes means standing beside them instead." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hall glowed warmly through the trees behind them while snow continued falling in slow, silent circles. Nathaniel finally broke the silence. "Do you remember what you told me the morning we first met?" Elizabeth nodded. "I asked whether you intended to thank me, or ask me to stop. I've thought about those words almost every day since." He smiled softly. "You never brought bread because I was a duke. You brought it because you believed no one should wake feeling forgotten." "Yes. I didn't understand then." His voice grew quieter. "I do." He turned fully toward her. "Elizabeth, somewhere between the first loaf and this Christmas, Ravensmere stopped feeling like a house I merely inherited. It became a home." She held his gaze without speaking. "And it became one because of you." The emotion she had kept carefully hidden all evening finally reached her eyes. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket. He did not take out a ring. Instead, he unfolded a small square of linen. The same plain linen that had wrapped the very first loaf of bread. "I kept it." Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. "You kept the cloth?" "I thought it would remind me never to become the man I had nearly allowed grief to make." He gently took her hand. "I cannot promise that life will always be easy. I cannot promise that I shall never make mistakes. But I can promise this. No morning of your life will ever begin with the feeling that you have been forgotten." Tears slipped quietly down Elizabeth's cheeks. She laughed through them. "That sounds remarkably like a proposal." "I believe it is." Her answer came without hesitation. "Then my answer is yes." Years later, visitors to Ravensmere Hall often noticed something unusual. Every Christmas morning before sunrise, A single warm loaf of bread rested upon the eastern steps. No announcement explained its purpose. No servant claimed responsibility. Those who needed it simply carried it home. When curious children once asked the Duchess why the tradition continued long after the old mystery had been solved, she smiled and repeated the lesson her father had taught her beside a warm bakery oven many years before. No one should wake believing the world has forgotten them. Nathaniel never corrected her. He simply placed the loaf beside hers each Christmas morning, grateful that the smallest act of kindness had led him not only to the woman he loved, but to the home he had been searching for all along.